The cabin lights flickered against polished shoes and glittering earrings, and all it took was the sight of a black passenger in a faded hoodie for the first smirks to spread like sparks across dry grass. They whispered as if she could not hear, laughed as if she could not feel, and judged as if they owned the sky itself. To them, she was nobody, another face pressed into the corner of their hierarchy, another body in the wrong seat. What they could not imagine was that the silence she carried was heavier than their noise, forged in places none of them could endure. The one they mocked would soon be the one who shifted the air in that cabin, the one who would bring hardened pilots to rigid salute. Before we begin, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories built on justice and revelation, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what starts as contempt will unravel into a truth they will never forget. Emily Carter stepped into the plane and immediately felt the weight of judgment that clung to the air like perfume. The cabin lights reflected off leather shoes and expensive carry-ons, and every set of eyes seemed to measure her worth in a split second. She wore a hoodie that had been washed so many times the fabric had lost its softness, and her sneakers bore the marks of years rather than months. To her, it was just clothing, functional and comfortable, but to them it was an announcement that she was out of place. Margaret Lane, the lead flight attendant, stood at the front of the business class section, her smile stiff with the polish of a woman who knew how to welcome and exclude at the same time. She took Emily's boarding pass, scanned it with a flicker of disdain, and handed it back with a voice sharp enough to cut even though it was coated in professional sweetness. Economy class is in the back, but today the plane's full, so you'll just have to sit here. The words hung in the air long enough for a few passengers to chuckle, the kind of laughter that didn't come from humor but from superiority. Emily kept her face calm and silent. She shifted her army green backpack on her shoulder, the fabric faded, seams worn, and a nearly invisible eagle patch stitched to the side. She moved down the aisle with deliberate steps, as though the narrow walkway was her own space and not one carved out reluctantly by strangers. A man in a pinstriped suit leaned toward his seatmate, his cufflinks flashing in the light. "Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station," he muttered, loud enough for Emily to hear. His companion laughed, and the sound rang out like a signal flare, calling others to notice. Emily's gaze remained fixed on the row numbers overhead. Her steps didn't falter. She wasn't here to answer them. She wasn't here to justify who she was. She simply needed to get to Washington, D.C., and the noise around her was just another kind of turbulence, one she'd learned long ago how to tune out. She slid into seat 14C, the window seat, and carefully tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her. Her fingers brushed against the eagle patch, and for the briefest moment her mind flicked back to another place, another time. One filled with roaring engines, tracer fire streaking across a midnight sky, and the feeling of her hands gripping controls steady enough to guide others home. Blinked once, pushing the memory aside, and focused again on the present. The man sitting next to her gave her a quick once-over before returning to his tablet. His Rolex gleamed like it had been polished just for this trip, and his cologne was strong enough to sting her eyes. He didn't speak, and she didn't mind. Silence was a language she spoke fluently. She turned her gaze to the oval window, letting the movement on the tarmac ground her. Mechanics swarmed around the plane, their reflective vests catching the sun, their gestures quick and efficient. She preferred their world, a world of structure, discipline, and machinery, to the one inside the cabin filled with smirks, sideways glances, and whispered judgments. Behind her, a young woman with gold earrings leaned into her phone call, pausing just long enough to throw Emily a dismissive look. Another passenger across the aisle laughed quietly at some comment Emily couldn't hear. The sound rolled across the cabin, directed at her without needing words. She adjusted her hoodie sleeves down over her hands and rested them lightly in her lap. She knew how to steady herself in storms, and this was just another storm, smaller and less dangerous than the one she had faced before. The cabin buzzed with energy, the kind of energy that fills a room when people believe they are better than someone else. Complimentary drinks clinked in glasses, laughter rose like the sound of waves crashing against rocks, and Emily sat motionless in the middle of it, a stone unmoved. Margaret walked past once more, her shoes clicking with authority against the floor, her eyes sliding toward Emily with a flicker of superiority before moving on to smile at the suited passengers. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement rehearsed, as if reminding Emily of the invisible hierarchy she was not part of. Emily didn't flinch. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a water bottle, and placed it on the tray table in front of her. Her thumb brushed against the cap in a rhythm only she noticed, each press steady and controlled. It was her way of breathing without making a sound, her way of reminding herself that silence didn't mean weakness. She had once sat in cockpits where silence meant survival, where every second of stillness was the difference between life and death. Compared to that, this flight was nothing. The laughter, the smirks, the assumptions, they didn't matter. They never had. What mattered was her composure, her discipline, and her ability to stay steady no matter how many eyes turned against her. The chatter grew louder when a woman in the row behind her leaned forward, her perfume sharp and deliberate, her hair styled in smooth waves that caught the cabin light. Vanessa Brooks rested her manicured hand on the headrest in front of her, just close enough to make Emily aware of her presence. "You must be so excited to be on a plane like this," Vanessa said, her tone sweetened with the kind of pity that was meant to wound. The words floated in the air long enough for a ripple of laughter to spread across nearby passengers. A man across the aisle snorted, shaking his head as if amused by the charity in Vanessa's voice. Another woman covered her mouth, her eyes flicking toward Emily with that same blend of judgment and curiosity. Emily's hand paused as she unscrewed the cap of her water bottle. She turned her head slightly, just enough for her eyes to meet Vanessa's. Her expression was calm, her gaze steady, and her words came out quiet but with the weight of stone dropping into water. "It's just a flight." The laughter around them faltered for a moment. Vanessa's smile twitched, the practiced sweetness slipping as she leaned back into her seat, flipping her hair with a motion sharper than necessary. The passengers who had chuckled moments before looked away, pretending they hadn't been listening, but the air still carried the remnants of their scorn. Emily tightened her grip on the bottle, just enough to crease the plastic before setting it back down on her tray table. Her heartbeat stayed steady, her breathing measured, her silence unbroken. The man beside her glanced up briefly from his tablet, curiosity flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing and turned back to his screen. Emily shifted her gaze to the clouds outside, their slow drift reminding her of nights in the cockpit, when stillness mattered more than sound. She could feel Margaret Lane's sharp eyes scanning the cabin as the lead attendant moved down the aisle. Margaret's smile was polished, her words professional, but when her gaze brushed over Emily, it carried the same dismissive edge as before. Margaret stopped to check on Robert Hayes, the suited man who had mocked Emily earlier, her tone warm and accommodating, then carried on without sparing Emily another word. It was a small thing, invisible to most, but Emily had lived too long with subtle slights to miss the message. Across the aisle, two women leaned closer to whisper. One of them, Tara Nelson, had glossy red nails that flashed as she gestured toward Emily. "Bet she's scared sitting near the exit," she said, her smirk sharp. Her companion giggled, their laughter meant to slice. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile, but she didn't turn. Instead, she reached again for her bottle, twisted the cap with controlled precision, and took a slow sip. Her silence was not weakness, it was defiance. Vanessa shifted in her seat behind, glancing toward her companion, Jessica Moore, a young woman with carefully painted lips who nodded as if the exchange had gone in their favor. But Vanessa's fingers tapped restlessly against her armrest, a small signal that Emily's calm answer had landed deeper than she wanted to admit. Robert Hayes leaned back, his voice pitched just enough to carry. "Some people just aren't cut out for flights like this," he said, shaking his head with mock sympathy. A few passengers chuckled, the sound subdued this time, less confident than before. Emily turned her face toward the aisle, her eyes finding Robert's for a brief second. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her voice was soft, but carried the unshakable firmness of someone who had drawn lines in places far more dangerous than this cabin. "I'll be fine." Robert's smirk faded, and he muttered something under his breath before sinking deeper into a seat. The laughter died quicker this time, leaving a thin film of unease in the air. Margaret returned again, her tray of drinks glinting in the light. She stopped at Vanessa's row, offering champagne with a polite nod, then moved on past Emily without so much as a glance. Emily adjusted her hoodie sleeves again, pulling them down to cover her hands. Her fingers brushed the eagle patch on her backpack, hidden beneath the seat. That patch was more than fabric, it was memory, a reminder of skies she had crossed when the world had been fire. She could feel the vibrations of the engines through her armrest, steady and consistent. The sound more comforting to her than anything inside this cabin filled with carefully groomed egos and subtle cruelties. The laughter from Vanessa and her companions behind her had died down, though the occasional whisper still carried forward, sharp and calculated. But Emily had already tuned it out, the same way she had tuned out cockpit alarms that screamed louder but meant less. She adjusted the water bottle on her tray table and rested her hands lightly on her lap, her posture giving away nothing. Margaret Lane, polished and poised, began moving down the aisle with a tray of glossy business class menus. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step deliberate, her smile tailored for the passengers she deemed worthy. She stopped at Robert Hayes, offering him a warm greeting, the kind of professional courtesy that dripped with extra sweetness for those who wore expensive suits. He accepted the menu with a self-satisfied smirk, his Rolex catching the light as he reached out. Margaret turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over Emily in her hoodie and sneakers, and then deliberately passed over her as if she wasn't there at all. "I'm sorry, we only have enough for our premium passengers," Margaret announced, her voice loud enough to carry beyond the row. Her eyes flicked toward Emily for just a moment, cold and dismissive, before moving on. Robert chuckled, turning in his seat just enough to share the moment with the man across the aisle, Daniel Price, who was already grinning. "Don't worry, she's probably used to fast food," Robert said, his tone casual but laced with derision. The cabin rippled with low laughter, a series of short, sharp sounds that carried the cruel satisfaction of a group enjoying someone else's humiliation. Emily's hand stilled on her lap for half a heartbeat, then moved again with quiet control. She reached for her water bottle, unscrewing the cap with the same calm precision as before, and took a slow sip. When she looked up, her eyes met Margaret's just long enough to hold them, and her voice, soft but steady, cut through the laughter like a drawn line in sand. "Water's fine," she said. The words weren't sharp, weren't loud, but they carried weight. Margaret blinked, her polished mask slipping for a fraction of a second. She nodded quickly and moved on, her heels clicking faster than before. The laughter that had rippled through the cabin died down more quickly than usual, the passengers returning to their drinks and conversations, though a few eyes lingered on Emily, curious now, unsettled by the composure that didn't crack even when mocked publicly. Emily set the bottle back on her tray table, her movement steady. Her silence was deliberate, her calm not an absence, but a presence, quiet but undeniable. Tara Nelson leaned toward her friend across the aisle, her voice low but still carrying. She didn't even fight back. Guess she knows her place. Her glossy red nails tapped against her glass, the sound sharp and mocking. But her friend, Jessica Moore, hesitated before laughing, glancing toward Emily as if unsure whether the joke landed the way it was supposed to. Emily's fingers brushed her hoodie sleeve down over her wrist, her eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. She had once sat in cockpits where fire lit the skies, where silence and control had been the only shield she had. Compared to that, this cabin was nothing. The arrogance, the disdain, the sneers, these were sparks, not flames, and sparks couldn't touch her anymore. Across the aisle, Daniel Price leaned over his armrest, his grin wide as he added his voice to the mockery. "Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag. Might be tough landing a job interview looking like that." A few passengers chuckled again, though the sound was thinner now, less confident than before. Emily turned her head just slightly, meeting Daniel's eyes with a gaze so steady it silenced him mid-laugh. Her voice was low but unshakable. "I'm good," she said. The words were simple, but the tone carried a finality that left Daniel blinking before he muttered something about kids these days and turned back to his drink. Emily turned back to the window, her face unreadable, her hand steady on the bottle. The faintest crease along the plastic was the only sign of the pressure she held beneath the surface, and even that she let go as she set it back down. Margaret continued her service, her smile returning for the premium passengers, but her eyes flicked once more toward Emily, as if unwillingly acknowledging the composure that her attempt at humiliation hadn't broken. The cabin returned to its rhythm of glasses clinking, conversations buzzing, and occasional laughter, but something in the air had shifted. The passengers still looked at Emily with disdain, but a subtle curiosity crept in, a question that hadn't been there before. Why hadn't she flinched? Why hadn't she fought back? Emily Carter, however, sat quietly in 14C, her hoodie sleeves drawn down over her wrists, her fingers brushing against the fabric in a steady rhythm. She had not been given a menu, she had not been offered any extras, but she had what she needed: water, silence, and composure. The humiliation had passed, but the atmosphere hadn't softened. Instead, it seemed the passengers were emboldened by what they thought was her acceptance of her place, and that arrogance would only grow sharper in the next hours of the flight. Robert Hayes adjusted his tie, leaning back with his tablet resting against his chest as he turned toward Daniel Price, who had already loosened his collar and was holding a half-finished drink in his hand. Robert's voice carried over the low hum of the engines, not loud, but perfectly pitched to be overheard. "She looks like she's headed to a job interview," he said, gesturing slightly toward Emily with his glass. "Hopefully she's got a better outfit in that bag, because showing up like this would be a disaster." A ripple of chuckles moved through the nearby rows, passengers who had been waiting for another chance to join in the game of ridicule. Tara Nelson smirked, her nails tapping against her cup, and Jessica Moore leaned closer to whisper something that carried just enough volume for Emily to know it was about her. Emily shifted her gaze from the window, turning her head slowly until her eyes met Robert's. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch long enough for his smirk to stiffen. When her voice came, it was quiet, level, and sharp enough to cut through the false humor. "I'm good." Robert blinked, his confident grin slipping as though the words had carried far more weight than their simplicity suggested. He muttered something under his breath about kids these days and turned back to his tablet, pretending disinterest, but the flush of discomfort along his jaw gave him away. Daniel, sensing the attention in the row, leaned over his armrest, his grin wide, eager to reclaim the audience. "What's next? You want to fly the plane?" His laugh was sharp, cruel, echoing in the cabin like a taunt from a schoolyard, except this was no schoolyard, and Emily was no child. She turned her eyes to him, the steady dark gaze that had once scanned skies filled with fire. Her hands remained calm on the water bottle, her voice a quiet thread of iron. "I've worked near planes before." The words hung in the air, so simple yet carrying an edge of mystery that unsettled Daniel far more than he expected. His grin faltered, his laugh dying in his throat as he shifted awkwardly in his seat, suddenly more interested in the drink in his hand than the woman in the hoodie. Around them, the passengers who had leaned forward to enjoy the spectacle pulled back, the cabin quieting as unease rippled through the air. Margaret, from her post at the front, caught the exchange, her sharp eyes narrowing, but she said nothing, her silence almost a recognition that something had shifted in the room. Vanessa Brooks glanced at Jessica, her brows raised, and Jessica only shrugged, her lips pursed. The mockery had landed differently this time, not with the victorious satisfaction they had enjoyed earlier, but with a weight that pressed uncomfortably on their own confidence. Emily turned back to the window, her movements slow, deliberate, controlled. She traced the horizon line with her eyes, steady as always, but beneath that calm exterior, a memory stirred. She remembered nights when the roar of engines had been more deafening than this cabin could ever be, when her hands had clutched controls that carried not just her life, but the lives of others. She remembered the static of radio chatter, the clipped voices of men who had relied on her to bring them through, and the silence afterward, the silence of survival. Compared to that, the sneers of passengers in business class were nothing. Yet the habits she carried from those nights remained. The grounding motions, the slow breaths, the stillness that came not from passivity, but from control. Daniel shifted again, his bravado clearly shaken, his earlier confidence replaced by an awkward silence. Robert tapped his tablet with unnecessary focus, pretending to read something that wasn't there. Tara whispered again, though her voice no longer carried the same sharpness, and Jessica didn't laugh this time, her eyes drifting toward Emily with a flicker of something else, curiosity or doubt. The cabin was quieter now, not the silence of peace, but the silence of realization, the creeping awareness that their target wasn't breaking. Emily leaned back in her seat, pulling her hoodie closer around her shoulders. She rested her hand on her backpack under the seat, her fingers brushing the faded eagle patch once more. The texture against her skin steadied her, reminded her of who she was, not who they believed her to be. She didn't need to correct them, not now. She only needed to stay steady, to remain herself, and let their own words weigh on them when the truth came forward in its own time. Emily Carter sat steady in 14C, her eyes on the shifting horizon through the oval window, her backpack pressed against her leg beneath the seat. Robert Hayes and Daniel Price had fallen into quieter tones after her last reply, their bravado tempered by her calmness, though the arrogance still lingered like smoke that refused to leave a room. Vanessa Brooks occasionally leaned toward Jessica more to whisper, but the laughter no longer came so easily. Tara Nelson still tapped her nails against her cup in practiced amusement, but her eyes flickered toward Emily more often now, uncertain, unsettled. The loudspeaker crackled overhead, and the captain's voice cut through the low hum of the cabin. "Folks, we're making a quick stop at Andrews Air Force Base for refueling. Shouldn't take long." The mention of a military base sparked an immediate shift in the energy of the business class section. Phones were checked, jackets adjusted, conversations sparked with new life. The idea of proximity to the military made some passengers straighten with pride, as though they were about to be part of something exclusive simply by association. Margaret reappeared at the front of the cabin, her voice carrying with rehearsed clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed that a few select passengers have been invited to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you've been notified." Her eyes swept across the cabin, lingering on the suited executives and the immaculately dressed women, and then slid past Emily as if she were invisible, her message sharpened by the deliberate exclusion. A few passengers smirked openly, Tara whispering to Jessica, "Well, they're certainly not inviting her," with a pointed glance toward Emily. Jessica giggled softly, hiding her mouth behind her hand, her eyes sparkling with cruel delight. Robert Hayes shifted in his seat, his tie adjusted with satisfaction, as though he were already preparing for his moment on the tarmac. Daniel Price leaned back smugly, muttering something about how certain circles were never meant for everyone. Emily's expression didn't change. She reached down, adjusting her backpack, and in the movement the edge of the faded eagle patch caught the cabin light. For a second, the symbol glinted, and her fingers brushed against it in a grounding gesture. Her eyes flicked to it, and in that touch a memory surged, unbidden and sharp. She saw the night sky alive with chaos, tracer fire streaking across blackness, engines roaring in her ears. She remembered her hands gripping controls, the sweat running down her back, and the calm she had forced into her voice when men in her squadron had relied on her commands to cut through fear. The memory was vivid, her call sign whispered in her ear, the moment of impossible odds when she had guided them home, every one of them, alive because she had not faltered. She blinked and the cabin returned, the chatter of passengers replacing the roar of jets. She pulled the hoodie sleeves down over her wrists, her fingers still pressing lightly against the eagle patch hidden once more beneath the seat. Tara's laughter floated forward again, sharp as glass, as she leaned into her friend. "They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed like that." Jessica nodded, her smirk practiced, her perfume clouding the air around her. Robert adjusted his jacket, his voice pitched low but meant to carry. "Screening should be tighter. Not everyone belongs in flights like these." Daniel chuckled, clinking his glass against Robert's in agreement. Emily turned her gaze back to the window, her eyes sharp but her expression steady. She saw the faint outline of the runway coming into view, the shapes of sleek aircraft glinting under the afternoon sun. Her hand tightened briefly on her water bottle before she released it again. Margaret moved down the aisle, checking on those she had deemed worthy, pausing to smile at Robert, nod at Daniel, and offer reassurances to Tara and Jessica that the upcoming meeting would be brief but special. She did not stop at Emily's row. She didn't look at her. She simply clicked past with her heels, marking the rhythm of practice dismissal. Emily leaned back into her seat, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something no one else could hear. The murmur of the cabin faded into background noise, and the steady hum of the engines was replaced in her mind with the familiar cadence of military radios, clipped words, precise tones, men acknowledging her orders with voices that carry trust, fear, and the hope of survival. She exhaled slowly, her breath steady, her pulse calm. Outside, the runway stretched closer, the outlines of F-22s lined in formation like silent sentinels waiting. The cabin around her swelled with anticipation, passengers straightening their clothes, checking their reflections in dark screens, eager for their turn to be seen. They whispered and smirked, certain they knew their places in the unspoken hierarchy, certain that Emily had none. The cabin stirred with energy as business class passengers perked up, adjusting ties and jackets, checking phones as though this stop was designed specifically for their benefit. Margaret Lane's voice came over the intercom, crisp and full of pride. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been granted the privilege of pausing briefly at Andrews Air Force Base. A few select passengers will have the opportunity to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you've been invited. Her tone carried an edge that made clear who was and who was not considered worthy. Her eyes swept across the cabin, resting warmly on Robert Hayes, Daniel Price, and Tara Nelson, before sliding coldly over Emily as if she were a shadow against the window. Tara smirked at Jessica Moore, whispering loudly enough to be heard. They definitely won't be inviting her. Jessica giggled, and Robert adjusted his jacket as if preparing for a photo opportunity. Daniel leaned back smugly, muttering about how exclusivity was the mark of distinction. Emily remained still, her gaze fixed on the jets outside, her fingers brushing lightly against the eagle patch hidden on her backpack. The cabin doors opened, and the sound of boots on metal steps carried inside before the figure of Major Lucas Grant appeared in the entryway. His uniform was immaculate, his presence heavy with authority, his posture the kind that drew attention without asking for it. He stepped into the cabin with sharp eyes that scanned the rows, offering firm handshakes and polite greetings to the passengers Margaret had clearly identified as important. Robert nearly leapt from his seat to shake his hand. Daniel grinned with forced familiarity, and Tara adjusted her scarf while batting her eyes, eager for acknowledgement. Grant nodded politely, his expression unchanged, but as his gaze moved further down the cabin, it locked suddenly onto Emily. He froze mid-step, his hand still half raised from a handshake, his jaw tightening as though he had just seen a ghost. The chatter of the cabin dimmed as passengers noticed his pause, confusion spreading like a ripple of unease. Emily lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm steadiness that suggested she had been expecting this moment all along. Grant broke the silence, his voice low at first, but filled with a reverence that carried. "Are you Falcon 7? The words struck the cabin like a thunderclap. Conversations halted, laughter died instantly, and every eye turned toward Emily. Robert blinked in disbelief. Daniel frowned as though trying to decipher the meaning, and Tara's smirk slipped into confusion. Margaret's eyes widened before narrowing, her smile stiffening into something brittle. Emily gave the faintest nod, her composure unshaken, her gaze never leaving Grant's. The Major straightened, his voice rising louder now, clear enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "My apologies, ma'am, for having you seated here. You are invited to the tarmac immediately." The collective gasp from the passengers was audible, the air thick with shock and disbelief. Robert let out a soft snort, trying to recover his confidence. "This has to be some mistake," he muttered, his voice dripping with skepticism. "She doesn't look like anyone important." Daniel nodded in agreement, though his eyes betrayed unease, while Tara whispered harshly to Jessica, "Maybe it's honorary. There's no way it's real." Grant didn't even glance at them. His attention remained fixed firmly on Emily, his respect evident in the way his posture shifted, his stance tightening like a soldier in the presence of a superior. Emily rose slowly, pulling her backpack out from beneath the seat and slinging it over her shoulder. Her movements were smooth, precise, the kind of deliberate grace that came not from chance, but from training. She tucked the faded eagle patch out of sight with one small adjustment, then straightened fully, her expression calm but commanding. Whispers filled the cabin like a rising tide. Passengers leaned across aisles, their voices a blend of confusion, doubt, and awe. Margaret stood frozen at the front, her carefully maintained smile faltering as Grant stepped aside to let Emily pass. As Emily moved down the aisle, the noise around her swelled into disbelief. A man in a navy suit leaned out, his voice raised with incredulous confidence. "There must be a mistake. She doesn't look like anyone important." His tone carried the smug certainty of someone used to being right, used to dismissing others. Emily's steps didn't falter. Her hand tightened briefly on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening for a moment, before she turned her head just slightly, her eyes locking onto his with quiet precision. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice soft but sharp, sliding through the air like a blade through silk. The man's mouth opened, then closed again, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. He sank back into his seat, his eyes dropping away. The passengers around him shifted uncomfortably, their certainty shaken. Grant gave the man a single, cold glance before focusing back on Emily, his eyes carrying a silent warning that silenced further protest. The cabin, once full of arrogance and laughter, had been transformed into a hushed theater of revelation. Every eye followed Emily as she walked, her sneakers making no sound against the floor, her head held high. There was no smugness in her expression, no vindication in her stride, only the calm authority of someone who had long since learned to carry herself without the need for approval. Margaret stepped slightly aside, her posture stiff, her throat working as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. Emily didn't look at her. She didn't look at Robert or Daniel or Tara or Jessica. She looked forward toward the open cabin door where the sunlight streamed in from the tarmac, toward the rows of jets that stood like sentinels outside. Ahead of her, lined in precise formation, stood the F-22 Raptors, their sleek bodies gleaming in the sun, wings outstretched like predatory birds guarding their domain. In front of those machines stood the pilots themselves, rows of uniforms crisp and unyielding, each man and woman straight-backed, their eyes fixed forward. Grant stopped at the edge of the formation, his voice booming across the tarmac with the command of a man used to being obeyed. "Attention, this is Night Falcon, the one who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." In perfect unison, every F-22 pilot snapped to attention, their hands rising in salute, the motion so sharp it seemed to cut the very air. Emily paused, her backpack still slung across her shoulder, the faded eagle patch catching the sunlight once more. She lifted her hand and returned the salute with crisp precision, the gesture etched into her muscles from years of discipline. A faint smile tugged at her lips, not of pride but of recognition, the kind of warmth that comes from seeing one's family again after years apart. The wind carried the moment, and inside the plane the passengers pressed harder against the glass, stunned at the display of respect being given to the woman they had dismissed only minutes before. Grant stepped aside, and a younger officer approached, carrying something cradled carefully in both hands. It was an old helmet, the surface worn but maintained, the visor scratched from use, yet polished enough to gleam. Across the side in bold letters was embroidered her call sign, Night Falcon. The officer held it out, his voice steady, but his eyes carrying the weight of reverence. "This belongs to you, ma'am." Emily took it with both hands, her fingers tracing the familiar ridges, the stitching of her name that had once been a secret. A legend whispered only in tight circles. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and the helmet transported her back to nights when the sky was fire and chaos, when the only thing between life and death had been her hands on the controls and her voice cutting through panic. She had worn this very helmet then, the weight of responsibility pressing down as heavy as gravity itself. But she had flown through it, and her squadron had survived because she had not faltered. She slipped the helmet on, her movements as natural as breathing, and when it settled against her head it was as if no time had passed at all. The fit was perfect, like it had been waiting for her return. The pilots in formation shifted almost imperceptibly, their eyes filling with something like awe as they saw her wear it again. From the line, a young pilot barely out of his 20s stepped forward, his face still boyish under the weight of his cap. He clutched something in his hand, and when he reached her, his voice trembled with emotion even as he tried to keep it steady. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago." He opened the small, weathered logbook, its edges frayed, the pages marked with ink and sweat. On one page, her call sign stood out sharp and unmistakable, the signature she had given without knowing how much it would mean. Emily looked at the page, then at him, her expression softening as her fingers brushed the paper. "You made it through," she said quietly, her voice filled with warmth that only he could fully understand. The young pilot's eyes shone, his throat working as he swallowed, and he stepped back into formation with a salute sharper than before, renewed strength flowing into his posture. The other pilots watched, their faces still controlled, but their eyes softer, the recognition spreading through them like a quiet wave. They knew what she had done, and now they remembered who she was. Emily removed the helmet, tucking it under her arm, her other hand resting lightly against her backpack strap. Her gaze swept across the formation of pilots, her eyes lingering on each of them, acknowledging them silently the way only a leader could. They responded without words, their salute held, their respect clear. Behind the cabin windows, Robert Hayes leaned back in his seat, scoffing to mask the heat rising in his cheeks, muttering something about Hollywood stories. Daniel Price shifted uncomfortably, his confidence evaporating. Tara Nelson stared at her phone, frozen mid-scroll, and Jessica Moore's smile was gone, replaced with uncertainty. Margaret Lane stood at the door of the plane, her hands clasped tightly, her polished smile brittle as she tried to maintain her composure. But Grant's glance toward the cabin was cold, a silent warning that he had heard every word of their scorn and knew exactly what they had said. Emily stayed calm, her expression steady, her presence a quiet storm that no mockery could diminish. She adjusted her hoodie sleeves again, pulling them down over her hands, the grounding motion familiar and unshakable. Another pilot, older this time, stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "She's the one who saved my squadron," he said, his words carrying down the line like a confession and a declaration all at once. Behind the oval windows, the passengers who had smirked, whispered, and laughed now leaned so close to the glass their breath fogged it, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some shook their heads as though denial might undo what they had seen, while others sat frozen, unable to reconcile the woman in a faded hoodie with a legend named Night Falcon. Emily stepped back into the cabin with the same measured calm she had carried from the beginning, her eyes steady, her hoodie sleeves still pulled low over her wrists. The passengers fell into an uneasy hush, the earlier arrogance replaced with a silence thick with confusion and unease. Margaret Lane stood stiffly near the front, her polished smile brittle, her eyes flickering down to the helmet as though it were radioactive. Robert Hayes scoffed loudly, shaking his head, muttering under his breath for everyone nearby to hear. "Sounds like a PR stunt. Probably just honorary." Daniel Price nodded quickly, though his voice lacked the confidence he had once thrown around so freely. "Yeah, can't be real. No way." Tara Nelson looked down at her phone, scrolling furiously as though searching for an answer, her glossy nails tapping like gunfire. Jessica Moore leaned close, whispering something sharp but uncertain. The doubt clung to them like armor, fragile but desperate, because to believe the truth meant admitting how cruelly wrong they had been. Emily said nothing. She simply returned to seat 14C, lowering herself with unhurried grace, her backpack once again at her feet, the helmet resting carefully in her lap. The faint metallic shine of its visor caught the cabin light, and the bold letters of her call sign stared back at anyone willing to look long enough. Some passengers avoided it, others couldn't stop staring. Margaret forced her professional tone, her voice overly bright, brittle at the edges. "Well, it's nice to have a special guest," she said. Her words aimed at diffusing tension, but her eyes betrayed her, darting nervously toward Emily's scuffed sneakers. Silence followed her statement, the kind of silence that made every word land heavier, the kind of silence that reminded the cabin of what had just happened outside. Then the younger attendant, Anna Brooks, no more than 25, stepped carefully down the aisle, her hands trembling slightly as she held a small object. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but her determination carried her words. "This is from the crew, for your service." She extended her hand, offering a silver eagle pin that glinted faintly in the cabin light. The air seemed to freeze. I turned toward Emily, every breath held in the space between the gesture and her response. Emily looked at the pin, then at Anna's nervous face, and reached out with quiet steadiness. She took the pin and with careful fingers attached it to her backpack strap, the eagle glinting against the faded green fabric. She did not speak, but the simple act carried more weight than any speech. Anna smiled a real, unguarded smile, then hurried back to her station, her eyes shining with a respect that none of the others had found the courage to show. The cabin remained quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when doubt collides with awe. Some passengers clung to skepticism like a shield, but others shifted uncomfortably, shame creeping into their faces. Robert adjusted his tie nervously, his arrogance cracking at the edges. Daniel sipped his drink too quickly, his hand trembling slightly. Tara set her phone down, unable to keep pretending she wasn't shaken. Emily leaned back in her seat, her hand brushing the helmet once more, her fingers tapping lightly against its surface in a slow rhythm. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and routine, announcing their taxi back to the runway. But before his words could finish, another sound broke through, a deep, powerful roar that vibrated through the cabin walls. Gasps rippled through the passengers as two F-22 Raptors appeared in perfect formation alongside the plane, their wings glinting like blades in the afternoon light. The entire cabin leaned toward the windows, disbelief giving way to awe as the jets flew so close their details were unmistakable. The intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't the captain. It was Major Grant's voice, carried clearly across the radio channel, and it was loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Night Falcon, we never got to thank you for last time." Emily lifted her head slowly, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. She reached for the headset Anna had placed quietly in a row, slipped it on, and pressed the mic to her lips. Her voice was steady, commanding, calm. "Hold formation, Eagle 1. The response came instantly, sharp and unified, a chorus of voices over the radio. "Yes, ma'am." Inside the cabin, silence fell like a stone. Robert Hayes froze with his drink halfway to his mouth, his hand trembling so much that drops of liquid spilled down his cuff. Daniel Price stared wide-eyed, his earlier smirk gone entirely. Tara Nelson clutched her phone in both hands, staring at Emily as if seeing her for the first time. Jessica Moore's lips parted, but no words came. Margaret Lane's polished facade shattered, her tray clattering against the counter as her hands shook. Emily sat calm, her eyes on the jets outside the window, her posture unchanged. She had given the order as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and to her, it was. For the F-22 pilots, it was instinct to obey. For the passengers, it was revelation. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. The hum of the engines filled it, the roar of the escorts amplified it, and Emily's calm presence sealed it. Every person who had laughed, sneered, or whispered at Emily Carter now sat stiff, their eyes averted, their posture betraying a discomfort that no amount of expensive suits or polished jewelry could cover. Emily sat steady in 14C, the helmet resting in her lap, the silver eagle pin glinting faintly on her backpack, her fingers tapping lightly against the surface of the helmet in a rhythm that seemed to match the beat of the engines outside. The cabin, which had once been alive with superiority and ridicule, now carried a weight of shame that hung heavy over every row. Robert Hayes was the first to break. The man who had mocked her appearance, dismissed her as someone unworthy, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence gone. He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting as he finally rose, his voice shaky though pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his gaze flicking toward Emily but never quite landing on her eyes. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." The words hung in the air, his apology genuine yet hesitant, and the passengers nearby looked at him with wide eyes, shocked that the same man who had so loudly ridiculed her now struggled to form sentences in her presence. Emily looked up slowly, her eyes steady but not unkind. She held his gaze just long enough to let him feel the weight of her silence, then gave a single, controlled nod before turning her attention back to the window. That was all, no rebuke, no speech, just acknowledgement. It was enough to leave Robert visibly shaken as he sank back into his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, as though trying to steady himself against a storm of his own making. Daniel Price, who had laughed the loudest when Robert mocked her earlier, now sat stiff and pale, his glass untouched on the tray before him. He opened his mouth once, as though to say something, then shut it again when Emily's eyes flicked briefly toward him. The memory of her words, "I've worked near planes before," echoed in his mind, and he shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. Tara Nelson clutched her phone tightly, her glossy nails digging into the case as she scrolled with frantic energy, pretending to be absorbed in the screen though her eyes flicked upward every few seconds toward Emily. Jessica Moore leaned in close to whisper to her, but her voice carried none of the confidence from earlier. It was shaky, uncertain, stripped of the cruel humor it once carried. Margaret Lane stood at the front of the cabin, her smile stiff and forced, her hands clasped tightly together. She had built her authority on judgment and exclusion, but now her presence seemed diminished, her control weakened by the silent storm that Emily's calmness had unleashed. Emily leaned back in her seat, her hoodie sleeves still pulled low, her presence unchanging. She had not spoken a word beyond what was necessary, had not defended herself or sought validation, yet the entire cabin had shifted around her. The same voices that had once mocked her were now silenced. The same eyes that had rolled at her appearance now looked away in shame. It was not victory she carried in her silence, but something deeper, a lesson, unspoken but undeniable. Silence did not mean weakness, composure did not mean insignificance, and humility did not mean absence of power. The engines hummed as the plane leveled off, and the F-22s outside held perfect formation, their presence a reminder to everyone watching that Emily Carter was not who they had believed her to be. She tapped the edge of her helmet again, a steady rhythm, her calmness radiating across the cabin. A man in a tailored blazer, too, rose ahead, shifted in his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. He turned toward her, his voice low, hesitant, yet audible enough to those nearby. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his words slow and halting. "I shouldn't have said what I did." Emily turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable, her voice absent. She simply nodded again, the same silent acknowledgement that had already shaken Robert. The man nodded back quickly, almost gratefully, before sinking into his seat, his shoulders hunched. The ripple spread quietly through the cabin. One by one, the passengers who had ridiculed her realized their own discomfort was heavier than any judgment they had once thrown at her. Their whispers ceased, their laughter silenced, their arrogance dissolved into uneasy quiet. Margaret's forced smile finally faded, and she busied herself with paperwork at the front, her movements jerky and unpracticed. Tara and Jessica whispered again, but this time their words lacked the sharpness they once carried, their voices full of uncertainty. Even Robert and Daniel kept their eyes on their laps, their earlier bravado gone. The silence inside the cabin held all the way until the wheels touched the runway at Reagan National, the faint jolt of landing doing nothing to shake the heavy mood that had settled among the passengers. The descent into Washington, D.C. was quiet, the skyline visible through the windows as a reminder that their journey was ending, though the lessons of it would follow many of them long after they disembarked. Emily Carter sat steady in 14C, the helmet still tucked under her arm, the eagle pin shining faintly on her backpack strap. She had not spoken since issuing the command to the Raptors, and she did not need to. The silence was her shield, her statement, her truth. Robert Hayes avoided her gaze, his hands clasped nervously on his lap, the executive confidence drained from his posture. Daniel Price shifted in his seat, his loosened tie hanging like a symbol of a man who had been stripped of arrogance. Tara Nelson kept her eyes on her phone, her fingers still but her screen black, the performance of distraction failing to hide her unease. Jessica Moore glanced toward Emily and then away quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Margaret Lane, the flight attendant who had built her authority on belittling, stood by the exit with her smile brittle, her eyes darting away whenever they landed on Emily. The cabin emptied slowly, the passengers gathering their bags, their movements careful, subdued, weighted with the shame of recognition. Emily stood at last, slipping her backpack over her shoulder, adjusting the helmet under her arm, her steps measured and unhurried as she walked down the aisle. She did not look at the passengers who shrank from her presence, nor did she linger. Her silence had already said what needed to be said. At the gate, a man waited. David Carter, tall and commanding in his simple tailored suit, his quiet presence louder than any introduction. His eyes locked onto Emily the moment she appeared, and though he said little, his nod and his step into stride beside her carried more weight than words. The passengers still lingering at baggage claim fell silent as they recognized him, their faces blanching as they understood not only who she was, but who she belonged with. Ethan Carter, the man who had once smirked and scrolled on his phone, dropped at mid-text, his confidence gone. Claire Donovan gripped her scarf tightly, her eyes downcast. Even Margaret, who busied herself with paperwork at the counter, moved with jerky haste, unable to mask her fear. The presence of David Carter was enough to seal what the jets and the salutes had already revealed. Emily Carter was not small, not invisible, and never to be dismissed. As they walked through the terminal, people moved aside without being asked, instinctively sensing the gravity of the moment. The helmet under Emily's arm caught the fluorescent light, the eagle pin glinting against her backpack, and the whispers began. A young girl, no more than 10, tugged on her mother's sleeve, her voice hushed but eager. "Is that the pilot lady?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who had stayed silent during the entire flight, looked at Emily and nodded softly. "That's her," she said, her voice carrying respect that needed no performance. Emily caught the girl's eye and allowed herself a small, genuine smile, warm and human, a smile that crossed the divide between what she had endured and what she had given. The girl grinned, clutching her mother's hand tighter, her eyes shining with the kind of awe that planted seeds for the future. Emily's hand brushed lightly against David's as they walked on, her steps unhurried, her head high. Behind her, the passengers who had mocked and sneered were left to grapple with the consequences of their own cruelty. By the next morning, Robert Hayes, the executive with the pinstripe suit and the loud jokes, found himself unemployed, his comments recorded and shared online until his company had no choice but to release him. Daniel Price's name was scrubbed from his consulting firm's roster, his arrogance replaced with disgrace. Tara Nelson's sponsorship deals evaporated as her sponsors distanced themselves from her viral mockery, her follower count plummeting as her apologies were drowned by comments calling her out. Jessica Moore's company issued a formal reprimand, her once bright image tarnished, her influence dimmed. Even Margaret Lane, who had hidden behind her polished smile, was reassigned to short domestic flights, her dreams of international prestige grounded. The reckoning was quiet but absolute, each of them forced to confront the reality that their words had weight and that the world no longer tolerated cruelty disguised as humor. Emily, however, paid no attention to any of it. She had lived through storms more violent than public scandal, had carried men home through skies on fire, and had endured losses heavier than the disdain of strangers. Their downfall was not her victory. It was simply the consequence of their own choices. She walked on with David by her side, the helmet still under her arm, the eagle pin glinting faintly as a reminder of the truth she carried. At the edge of the tarmac, with the DC skyline rising against the horizon, Emily paused for just a moment. The wind tugged at her hoodie, but she did not pull it tighter. She stood steady, her shoulders squared, her presence undeniable. The world had doubted her, mocked her, tried to make her small, but she was not small. She never had been. Her silence, her composure, her resilience had been enough to withstand every attempt to diminish her. And for anyone who had ever been judged, overlooked, or silenced, her story was a quiet promise. You are not alone. You never were. Emily Carter walked forward, her helmet under her arm, her husband beside her, the city stretching before her. She did not look back. She did not need to. The end. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, I'd love for you to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Tell me in the comments what you think about Emily Carter's journey. Was the cabin's change of heart enough, or should more have been said? I also want to know where you're watching from, because stories like this connect people in different places in powerful ways. Your thoughts and support help me keep bringing these long, dramatic stories to life. So don't hold back. Share what moved you most.